Okay, so continuing on with, of course, what we were talking about last time, how Jesus Christ came, he established the new covenant. We're not bound to keep the Old Testament Sabbath. Okay. Last week we talked about, for example, in 2 Corinthians chapter 3, if you guys remember, where it says that God has written on our hearts the law, and that's the law that we have to follow, the law that's written on our hearts. The question now is, what is that law? It's not the law of the 10 Commandments, because we read last week in 2 Corinthians that it's not the law that is written on tablets of stone, the 10 Commandments of the Old Testament. It's the commands that God infuses in our hearts by the power of the Holy Spirit. Okay. And he also talks about how the old covenant, he calls the what's written on tablets the ministry of death, because it doesn't give us life, right? Jesus Christ is who gives us life, and we are to follow his commands. Okay. And we're going to see right now, as we saw last time, that the Old Testament Sabbath, 6 days you got to work, and on the seventh day you got to rest, that's not a command that us Christians need to follow. So don't be afraid when Seventh-day Adventists tell you that, all right? One of the things that Seventh-day Adventists say is, wait a minute, go to Genesis chapter 2, verse 3. There it says God made the seventh day holy. It says God blessed the seventh day and he made it holy. He sanctified it. He set it apart. But how is this an argument for observance of the Sabbath by Christians? Because in the Old Testament, we see God sanctified many holy days, not just the seventh day of the week. Yet those are not observed by the Seventh-day Adventists. So this is picking and choosing. I want this law, but I don't want this law, if you're using this argument, right? If you look at, for example, Nehemiah chapter 8, verses 9 to 12, it talks about the feast. It took place during the Feast of Trumpets, because it says that it was the 7th month, the first day of the month. That in the Old Testament was the Feast of Trumpets, which is not something that's practiced by the Adventists, okay? That day is called holy to the Lord. Let's check it out right here. Okay. Whoops. Okay. It says Nehemiah, who was the governor, and Ezra, the priest and scribe, and the Levites, who taught the people, said to all the people. So they, in this context, they were reading the words of Moses, the words that Moses wrote. Okay, that's the context of it. They're reading the words that Moses wrote, and they are explaining it. So it's not, see, even in the Old Testament Jews, they didn't just read the scriptures and then, figure stuff out on their own. They had authorities that would actually explain the scriptures, just like we have now in the New Covenant. It says here, this day is holy to the Lord your God. Do not mourn or weep. So again, in the context, if you read from verse 1, it actually mentions that it's the 7th month, the first day of the month. That's, according to Leviticus chapter 23, that's the Feast of Trumpets, okay, where they would blow trumpets in preparation for the Day of Atonement. The Day of Atonement, the Feast of Trumpets, neither of them are practiced by the Seventh-day Adventists. Why? It's called holy. Why don't they do it? This day is holy to the Lord your God. Do not mourn or weep, for all the people wept as they heard the words of the law. They heard the words of Moses and they started crying, and they said, do not cry, do not mourn, do not weep. This is a holy day to the Lord. It's a holy day of God. Then he said to them, go your way, eat the fat and drink sweet wine. Drink sweet wine. Drink wine. But Seventh-day Adventists say that we can't drink wine or any alcoholic beverages. What's going on there? And send portions to anyone who has nothing ready, for this day is holy to our Lord. Repeat it again. And do not be grieved, for the joy of the Lord is your strength. So the Levites calmed all the people, saying, be quiet, right? Be still, be calm, for this day is holy. A third time, 3 times, right? Like the Holy Trinity. Do not be grieved. And all the people went their way to eat and drink and to send portions and to make great rejoicing. They were happy because they had understood the words that were declared to them. Okay. So clearly, the Feast of Trumpets is called what? A holy day to the Lord. And it lands on different days in our calendar. For example, in 1789, or I was looking at a calendar of 1788, 1789, around there. Guess what day it landed on? A Monday, right? And so we have this holy day not practiced by the Seventh-day Adventists, right? And so I wrote here, why don't the Adventists observe this? If you were to ask the Seventh-day Adventists why they don't observe it, they'll say, oh, because that's ceremonial, okay? It was pointing to Jesus Christ, but it was pointing to the fulfillment in the new covenant. Now the new covenant has arrived, and we say amen. That's the same thing with the Old Testament Sabbath, according to Colossians chapter 2, verses 16 and 17. We don't need to observe the Old Testament Sabbath day because that was pointing to Christ too. Christ has already come, and so we cling to Jesus. Okay? Next, I'm going to show you guys Nehemiah chapter 10, verse 31. The same book of the Old Testament, the book of Nehemiah, chapter 10, verse 31. It says, if the peoples of the land bring in goods or any grain on the Sabbath day to sell, we will not buy from them on the Sabbath. Why? Because they're Jews. These are Old Testament Jews. They're practicing the Old Testament Sabbath because they're Old Testament Jews, right? They're under that covenant. They're under that law. They have to do it. And he says, we will not buy from them on the Sabbath or on a holy day. So you have the Old Testament Sabbath, and then you have other days that are holy too. It's not just the Sabbath. It's not just the Old Testament Sabbath. And we will forego the crops of the seventh year and the exactation of every debt. So it's very clear that from the Old Testament, you have other days that are called holy to the Lord, not just the Old Testament Sabbath day. What about now Leviticus chapter 25, verse 12? Leviticus chapter 25, verse 12. It says here, the year of Jubilee, which again, this is not practiced by Seventh-day Adventists, the year of Jubilee, right? It says it is a Jubilee. And by the way, later on we'll talk about what exactly is the year of Jubilee when we get to the book of Leviticus, God willing, okay? Just know for now that it's something that's not practiced by the Seventh-day Adventists, okay? It says, it shall be holy to you. You may eat the produce of the field, okay? And so the year of Jubilee is holy, and God says it is to be holy to you, right? And so if the Seventh-day Adventists want to say, well, the Old Testament Sabbath day of the week, it was made holy. It's holy. God says it's holy to you, right? Well, he says the same thing about other days, though. Other days are also sanctified. Other days are also made holy. And notice how it says, it shall be holy to you. Who is God talking to in the book of Leviticus? The audience of the book of Leviticus, in that, if you read the book of Leviticus, start from verse 1, start from Leviticus chapter 1, verse 1. It's God speaking to Moses, and he's telling Moses, say this to the Israelites. Say this to the Old Testament Jews. Okay? It's very clear that just because it says that the Old Testament Sabbath day of the week is holy, that doesn't mean that it is binding on Christians. So Seventh-day Adventists are using an inconsistent method if that's what their argument is. Because there's a whole bunch of other days that are also, they are also called holy. They're also called holy, yet even though they're called holy, the Seventh-day Adventists don't practice it. So it would be hypocrisy. It's a bad hermeneutic, which is a smart way of saying it's a bad way of interpreting things, okay? What about Exodus chapter 31, verses 12 to 17? This is another thing that they show. Exodus 31, verses 12 to 17. It says, and the Lord said to Moses, you are to speak to the people of Israel. So who is he talking to? Who is Moses talking to? The people of Israel. It doesn't say, this shall be for the Christians. It's talking to the Old Testament Jews, the Old Testament people of Israel, and say, above all, you shall keep my Sabbaths, for this is a sign between me and you throughout your generations. So it is a sign between me and you, the Israelites. Don't take it out of context. He's talking to the Israelites. That you may know that I, the Lord, sanctify you. You shall keep the Sabbath, because it is holy for you. Right? Just like he said about the Feast of Trumpets, just like it is stated about the year of Jubilee, just like it is stated about other holy days in the Old Testament to the Jews. Everyone who profanes it shall be put to death. Okay? And by the way, when it says be put to death, the reason is actually threefold at least. Number one, because if you read these laws of the Old Testament, you'll see the hard-heartedness of the Israelites. God took them out of Egypt. Imagine the waters. Imagine God saved you from slavery, and then he opens up the waters, and you walk through dry land, and then the water closes on your enemies. That's a huge miracle, right? Well, even then, guess what happened? Guess what the Israelites kept doing? They kept complaining. They went so much against God and Moses, even amidst all the great miracles that were happening, that God had no choice but to put what we call a deterrent, something that is a strong punishment, so that people could watch themselves before they commit it. That's why this starts in Exodus chapter 19, guys. In Exodus chapter 19, God says anybody that gets near the mountain, they will be put to death. Why did God say that? Because God knew that of their hard-heartedness, and he said, I should tell them this because, this is going to be a prevention so that they could actually listen, because they're so hard-hearted and they don't listen even amidst the miracles, right? And God appeared with, thunder and lightning, and so it was a way of causing people to think twice before doing something. Okay. Then it says, whoever does any work on it, that soul shall be cut off from among his people. 6 days shall work be done, but the seventh day is a Sabbath of solemn rest, holy to the Lord. Whoever does any work on the Sabbath day shall be put to death, so that they could actually respect God's law, because they weren't respecting it, and so God ended up putting these deterrents. Now, it wasn't the case that literally somebody breaks the Sabbath and you got to, automatically kill the person. There was a trial that would take place, right? And we see situations where, you take a circumstance, the person's circumstance into consideration. But anyways, we'll talk more about that later on. And it says then, therefore, the people of Israel shall keep the Sabbath, observing the Sabbath throughout their generations as a covenant forever. Okay. It is a sign forever between me and the people of Israel, that in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, and on the seventh day he rested and was refreshed. So this is what they use, okay, oftentimes. But it's not going to work, because number one, it says as a covenant forever, and this is what they point to, right? First, they say that it's holy for you, but that doesn't work, because other days and even the Jubilee year is called holy to the Israelites too, but the Seventh-day Adventists don't observe it. So the next thing they try to do is they try to say, it is a covenant forever. That means you got to keep the Old Testament Sabbath forever. No. Remember, he's talking to the Old Testament Israelites, the people of Israel, first of all. And God says the same thing about circumcision in Genesis chapter 17, verse 7, and Genesis chapter 17, verse 13. God says, I will establish my covenant between me and you and your offsprings after you throughout their generations for an everlasting covenant, to be your God to you and to your offspring after you. Both he who is born in your house and he who is bought with your money shall surely be circumcised. So in the case of circumcision, right, it's talking about circumcision, and it calls it an everlasting covenant, right? So shall my covenant be in your flesh, an everlasting covenant. Seventh-day Adventists don't believe in circumcision. So isn't that ironic that they're pointing to Exodus chapter 31, which calls the Sabbath an everlasting covenant? Yet in Genesis, circumcision is called an everlasting covenant. Does that mean that we all got to get circumcised? According to the Seventh-day Adventists, no. Notice how they're again being hypocritical with their interpretation. On the one hand, they want to apply it to the Sabbath. It says everlasting. That means we got to do it. Well, it says the same thing for circumcision. So do we need to get circumcised also on the 8th day as it's written in the Old Covenant? No, we don't need to do that. It's hypocritical interpretation. The same thing with the Day of Atonement, guys. The Day of Atonement, Leviticus chapter 16, verse 34, says, this statute shall be forever for you, that atonement may be made for the people of Israel once in the year because of all their sins. So in the Day of Atonement, you would have the high priest walk into the Holy of Holies and make atonement for the people of Israel. This is the Day of Atonement, not observed in this form, not practiced by the Seventh-day Adventists. So they're being hypocritical when they bring that up. The truth is that the word everlasting, guys, is the word olam in Hebrew, which it doesn't necessarily mean literally forever and ever until the end of time. It can mean a shorter period of time, such as long as a covenant lasts. An example of this is Exodus chapter 21, verse 6. Let's take a look at Exodus chapter 21, verse 6. It's talking about a situation where a person works for another. Now, back in the day, guys, it wasn't like the economy today where you go and you apply for a job. You really had two choices. Number one, either you're making your own money in some way, shape, or form by a craft or a business or something, or you're growing your own crops or field. Or number two, you have to work for somebody. But if you're going to work for somebody else, the way that they would do it in those times is they would become their servants. Okay? They would go and then they would work for the person, and they would live in their homes. They would be provided food, water. They would be treated with respect according to the law of Moses, which we could get into later on. And in some circumstances, the boss, the master, would give their daughters in marriage. So don't think when you see master or servant in the Old Testament that it's like, master and slave relationship like in, the Confederate States, antebellum South, right? That's not how the Israelites thought. They saw these servants as made in God's image, and they had no problem giving their daughters in marriage to them. And so it was a completely different situation, and they were called to be treated with respect. And we'll talk more about that later on. There was a circumstance where the person, they could work, and then after 6 years, they'd get released. So if they owed a debt, because this would be another circumstance, if you owed a debt and you couldn't pay it off, you would have to work it off. Let's say I owe you 10 years of debt. I'm not going to work for you 10 years. I'm only going to work for you 6 years. And on the seventh year, you got to release me. That was what the law of Moses said. Now, there were some circumstances where a person would go, I really like the person that I work for. He treats me awesome. And I'm not very good with businesses. I'm not good with, taking care of things on my own. I'd rather just work for this person and just, keep the job that I have now. You weren't allowed to do it willy-nilly. You had to present yourself to the judges, and you had to tell the judges with your own mouth, I want to work for this guy for the rest of my life. That guy couldn't tell, the boss could not go and say it for you. You had to go yourself and say, yes, I want to do it. Now, what would happen is they had this ceremony, and it said at the very end, it would say this: he shall be his slave forever, or his servant forever, right? The word there is obed, which just means slave or servant, right? It doesn't necessarily mean somebody who was forced into being a slave, because that was actually illegal in ancient Israel. And in Exodus chapter 21, verse 18, I believe it is, it says that anybody who kidnaps another person to enslave them or to, sell them off, they'll be put to death for doing that. And so it was against the law. It's talking about a voluntary servant, because the guy said with his own mouth, I want to be this guy's servant forever. Okay, that's the context of this. It says, he shall be my slave, or he shall be a slave or a servant, olam, forever. Does that literally mean that he's gonna be a servant forever and ever until the end of time? Even when they're in heaven, he's gonna be a servant. Even in the day of resurrection, he's gonna be a servant? No, it's only until he dies. So it's for a limited time. It's not forever and ever. And so the word olam can mean forever and ever, or it could just mean until the covenant, as long as the covenant lasts. So yeah, as long as the old covenant is in effect, they have to do the Sabbath, the Old Testament Sabbath. But now it's no longer in effect. We have Jesus Christ who ushered in the new covenant. We have the new covenant now, guys. And we are to observe that, right? Now notice this. Let's go back to Exodus chapter 31. Look at what God said. It says, it is a sign forever between me and the people of Israel. It is a sign. A sign of what? A sign of the old covenant, right? Because he says here, therefore, the people of Israel shall keep the Sabbath, observing the Sabbath throughout their generations as a covenant forever. It is a sign forever. So it is the sign of the old covenant. It is a sign of the old covenant, observing the Old Testament Sabbath. Are we under the old covenant? No, we're under the new covenant. So why does the Seventh-day Adventist Church want to bind us to a sign that is for old covenant? The sign of the old covenant is the Old Testament Sabbath. So why are the Seventh-day Adventists trying to bind us to that sign of the old covenant? We're not under the old covenant. Notice Sabbath is the sign of the old covenant, not the new covenant, right? It's the Old Testament Sabbath is a sign of the old covenant. So it backfires completely when the Seventh-day Adventists, when they try to use verses like Ezekiel chapter 20, verse 20. Ezekiel chapter 20, verse 20, okay? They say, God is speaking here and he says, keep my Sabbaths holy that they may be a sign between me and you, that you may know that I am the Lord your God. See, do you want the sign of God? Do you want to be, gods? You got to keep the Old Testament Sabbath. Well, who's God talking to here? Let's go back and let's read it in context, not out of context, like these people like to take it out of context. So look at what it says here in context, okay, not out of context. It says, moreover, starting from verse 15, okay, it says, moreover, I swore to them, who's them? In the wilderness, it's obviously talking about the ancient Israelites, when they were in the wilderness for 40 years, right? They were in the wilderness, and the next generation was a generation that was allowed to enter into the promised land, including Joshua and Caleb. So in the context, it's talking about the ancient Israelites. He says, I swore to them in the wilderness that I would not bring them into the land that I had given them, a land flowing with milk and honey. And that's true because they were in the wilderness, the desert. They were in the wilderness for 40 years until that generation died off, because that generation was not allowed to enter into the promised land because of their sin and rebellion against God. Even though God would bring them food down from heaven, even though God opened up the waters for them and swallowed up their enemies, even though God saved them from slavery, they just kept rebelling against God, and they kept rebelling against Moses, who was God's authority um, that he established on earth. He says, the most glorious of all lands, because they rejected my rules and did not walk in my statutes and profaned my Sabbaths. Who? They, the ancient Israelites. It's not talking about Christians. For their heart went after their idols. Nevertheless, my eye spared them, and I did not destroy them or make a full end of them in the wilderness. And I said to their children, who? The Israelites' children, who are Israelites. I told their children in the wilderness, do not walk in the statutes of your fathers, nor keep their rules, nor defile yourselves with their idols. I am the Lord your God. Walk in my statutes and be careful to obey my rules and keep my Sabbaths holy, that they may be a sign between me and you. Me and who? Me and the Israelites. It's talking about the ancient Old Testament Israelites, guys, that you may know that I am the Lord your God. So how funny that they take verse 20 and they think that it applies to Christians when in the context it's talking to the ancient Israelites, the Old Testament Israelites. Truthfully, it doesn't apply to us. Colossians chapter 2, verses 16 to 17 says, therefore, let no one pass judgment on you in questions of food and drink, or with regard to a festival, or a new moon, or a Sabbath. These are a shadow of the things to come, but the substance belongs to Christ. Those were shadows of Christ. Christ has already come, and we cling on to Christ. We don't need to follow those laws. Now, another thing that they like to mention, moving on now, it says, in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, and on the seventh day he rested and was refreshed. See that? That's why we got to do it. We have to do it because God did it. But wait a minute. Does God work 6 days and then rest on the seventh, and then work 6 days and then rest on the seventh, and then work 6 days and then rest on the seventh, like the way that the ancient Jews did it? Does God do that? Well, no. In actuality, as we learned last time, the Old Testament Sabbath was modeled after God's creation week, right? He created in 6 days, and on the seventh day he rested from his work. But what work? He rested from his work of creation, the creation week. God entered his rest, and he remained in his rest. But if the Old Testament Sabbath is the rest of God, then that means it should be eternal. You should be able to go in it and remain in it. But that's not what happens. You go in it the seventh day, and then on the first day you start to work again. This shows us that this shows us that the Old Testament Sabbath week, the Old Testament Sabbath day, what it was modeled after God, but it wasn't as I wrote it down here. It was modeled after God's rest, but it's not God's rest. It's not what God wills for us New Covenant Christians, actually. It's not what God wills for us in the fullness. Because what God offers us now is an eternal rest in him, in this life and in the next. We see that in Colossians chapter 2, verses 16 to 17, which we just read, but we also see it in Hebrews chapter 4, verses 1 to 10. Okay? And so I wrote down here, Adventists say, well, God made a whole, and this is another thing, right? They say, I should probably get into that next, but I wrote down here, God never got out of his Sabbath, okay? His Sabbath is a rest from the creative act / God's creation in Genesis 1. He went into a Sabbath and he didn't get out of it, right? But the point here is that God entered his rest and he remained in there. God doesn't work 6 days and then rest on the seventh the way Old Testament Jews were commanded to do. God entered his rest and he remains in it until he creates a new heavens and new earth when Christ comes again. The Sabbath rest given to the Israelites in the Old Testament was modeled after God's rest. It was not God's rest. It was pointing to God's rest. Christ brings the true rest, which we're going to read right now in Hebrews chapter 4. Now, before we read Hebrews chapter 4, Adventists also like to say, well, God made it holy, so that means that they must have entered into his rest. Well, God made it holy. God set it apart because it was the day that he entered into his rest, right? But that doesn't mean that he commanded Adam and Eve to do it. There is no indication anywhere in Genesis chapter 2 where God commanded them to do it, to observe the Old Testament Sabbath. That didn't come about until Exodus chapter 16. And even Adventists there, they try to prove that, oh, look, actually, Exodus 20, the 10 commandments of the Old Testament, that's not when God first gave the Old Testament Sabbath. It actually came before, because we read in Exodus chapter 16 that God gave it, to the Israelites. We also see that God gave circumcision in Leviticus. We see it, for example, in Leviticus chapter 12. Circumcise your male children on the 8th day. But guess what? Circumcision didn't start with Moses. Circumcision didn't start in the Mosaic law. Circumcision goes back to Genesis. So by that logic, we have to keep circumcising too, since it goes even back before that, right? So notice how these justifications that the Seventh-day Adventists try to give, it doesn't work. It ends up backfiring on them. And so they say, oh no, well, God must have commanded. Well, where does it say that God commanded them? Even if we assume, let's assume for a second that God commanded them. If you look, God created Adam. It says it was it talks about the 5th day, what God created on the 5th day. Read Genesis chapter 1. It says what God created on the 5th day, and then it says there was evening and there was morning. The 5th day, right? That was the 5th day. And so on the 6th day, God created Adam, and later on, he created Eve, according to Genesis chapter 1. Now, according to the Old Testament hermeneutic or Old Testament setup, as well as what Seventh-day Adventists say, they say that a new day, begins sunset the day before. Okay, that means that the 7th day of God started the evening of day 6. So God made Adam and Eve, and then they entered God's rest. Let's assume that they actually did enter God's rest when God entered it. But God entered rest when? On the 7th day? But it was still man's first day. A complete 24 hours hadn't happened yet until, the next day. But they entered the rest on the evening of the day that they were created. If we're going to follow that belief, right? That they rested when God rested, right? And so that means that they rested when? On their first day on earth, the first day of their week. They started their week with rest. So by that logic, that means we need to be observing Sunday, because Sunday is the first day of the week according to the Bible. So even by their hermeneutic, it proves that the fulfillment of the Old Testament Sabbath is the first day of the week. When they sinned, it corrupted what God had established for them. So now they cannot enter their rest on the first day of the week. They cannot begin their week with rest the way that God had established it. They instead had to wait until the last day, the 7th day. But Jesus Christ turned it back to the first day, and that's why Christians observe Sunday. Okay? So even going by that, we see that they started their week in rest. So why don't they observe Sunday? Either way you want to go, we see the importance of Sunday. How ironic for the Seventh-day Adventists. And the reason Another thing that I'd like to mention, actually, is that the Seventh-day Adventists have no right to appeal to their tradition because their tradition is not the ancient apostolic tradition. So they can't say, oh, it's not written down, but we believe it. The reason why I'm saying that they need to prove it with the Bible is because that's what they believe. They believe in sola scriptura, apparently. They believe in only the Bible, apparently. So let's use their own hermeneutic. Show us with the Bible how you believe that this is true. Unless they want to appeal to their false prophet, Ellen G. White, right? But that's a story for another time. So let's continue here. We're going to go through Hebrews chapter 4 and Hebrews chapter 4. Okay. Now, before I read Hebrews chapter 4, I should mention that Seventh-day Adventists run to Hebrews chapter 4 a lot too. They say, oh, Hebrews chapter 4, verse 9, it says that a Sabbath rest remains. Let's go to that. Verse 9, so then there remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God. Wait a minute. Don't you guys want to be the people of God? The answer is yes, right? You want to be God's people. Where it says here, there remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God. So that means that you have to observe the Old Testament Sabbath. But no, in the context, it's not talking about the Old Testament Sabbath. It's talking about entering God's rest. Okay? Entering God's rest, which is a rest that God offers us that is an eternal rest. Eternal, forever rest in me, forever trust in me. So let's take a look at what it is. It says, while the promise of entering his rest still stands, let us fear lest any of you should seem to have failed to reach it. So the author of the Hebrews is saying, hey, be cautious. Make sure that you have entered God's rest. For good news came to us just as to them. Now, in the context in Hebrews chapter 3, it actually ends with talking about the Old Testament Israelites and how they basically would rebel against God and they were unfaithful to God. Okay? It says, good news came to us just as to them, but the message they heard did not benefit them because they were not united by faith with those who listened. So even though the message went to them, it was of no effect. It didn't benefit them because they didn't believe in it. They didn't accept it with faith. For we who have believed enter that rest. So those of us, by believing in the Lord Jesus Christ, by accepting him, we have entered his rest. We accept his salvation. As he said, as I swore in my wrath, they shall not enter my rest. This is a reference to Psalm 95. Do you guys have any idea when Psalm 95 was written? In the year 1000 BC. And God says, as I have swore in my wrath, they shall not enter my rest. What does that mean? When this was written, God is in his rest and he wants people to enter into it. How do you enter into it? Well, let's keep reading. Although his works were finished from the foundation of the world, right? Because from the beginning in Genesis 1, we read that God created, and Genesis 2, he entered his rest. But here, it says that years later, ages later, he's still in his rest because the creation week is finished, basically. Since therefore it remains, verse 4. For he has somewhere spoken of the seventh day in this way, and God rested on the seventh day from all his works. And again, in this passage, he said, they shall not enter my rest. We want to enter that, right? We want to enter God's rest. Since therefore it remains for some to enter it, and those who formerly received the good news failed to enter it because of disobedience, again, he appoints a certain day, today, saying through David so long afterward in the words already quoted, today, if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts. So what's the answer? The answer is today. Today you could accept God in your heart. It's not saying the Old Testament Sabbath day or the Sabbath day of the week. It's saying today, any day. Today, if you hear his voice, harden not your hearts. Accept him. Accept his will in your life. That is the rest that God wants you to have. To have faith in him, to trust in him, to lean back on him forever, in this life and in the next. So this shows us, in accordance with Colossians chapter 2, verses 16 and 17, that the true rest, the rest that the Old Testament Sabbath was pointing to, is Christ himself. And he says, for if Joshua had given them rest, God would not have spoken another day later on. So an argument that many people might bring up is, wait a minute, no, the rest that God is talking about is entering the promised land, entering Cana, the land of Cana. But here the author of Hebrews says, no, it's not it. Because literally in 1000 BC, when they're already in the promised land, they're already in the land of Cana, God says, God speaks of another day, and the answer is today. Okay? Today, if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts. So the argument that the author of Hebrews, the inspired author of Hebrews, what the Bible here is saying, is that the true rest of God is the rest that we could receive today, regardless of what day it is. It is because it is accepting God's will in your life, accepting him. Okay? That is the rest that he's talking about. If Joshua had given them rest, because who is Joshua? Joshua, the old covenant Joshua? Right? Old covenant Joshua. He's the one that allowed, or he's the one that brought the Israelites into the promised land. Okay? And so he said, if he had given them rest, God would not have spoken later of another day. So then there remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God. For whoever has entered God's rest has also rested from his works as God did from his. God rested from the creative act, but he still works because he has to sustain creation, right? And so even though on a day-to-day basis we could be working, we have entered God's rest for real because we accept him and we accept his will. That is the point here. In accordance with what's written in Colossians chapter 2, verses 16 to 17. Okay? So it's pretty clear, guys, that as I wrote here, I said, yes, but it is not the Old Testament Sabbath. It is today, meaning every day, because every day we ought to accept God's will into our life, and that allows us to enter into his rest, which is a true rest. The rest God offers us is an everlasting rest, not the Old Testament Sabbath, which is a shadow of the New Covenant Sabbath. It's a sign of what is to come, but that fulfillment has already come. And again, what is the New Covenant Sabbath? Colossians 2, verses 16 to 17 says it is Christ. Thus, we must be followers of Christ and what he established, accept what he established for us, and be in communion with the church that he founded. So I recommend watching the video on the papacy if you guys haven't already. And following his law, the law that he brought to us, in accordance with what is prophesied in the Old Testament. The prophet Isaiah, 700 years before the time of Christ, he says in Isaiah 42:4, he says that the coastlands, the whole world, waits for his law. But he has already come, and he brought us his law. John 14:15, Jesus says, if you love me, you will keep my commandments. And he never commanded us to complete the Old Testament Sabbath. So, almost done here. It says Jesus and this is another thing that they say, guys. So be very prepared because this is another thing. This is a cheap shot. This is what I call a cheap shot that they make. They say, Jesus and the apostles and the followers of Jesus observe the Sabbath of the Old Testament. Okay. Or they will say Jesus only, right? They will say Jesus observed the Old Testament Sabbath. Okay. Obviously, because according to Galatians 4:4, it says, God sent forth his son, Jesus Christ, born of women, born under the law of Moses. He was an Old Testament Jew. He was born in the Old Covenant. Of course, he had to observe the Old Testament Sabbath. Why don't they quote Luke chapter 2, where Jesus was circumcised in accordance with the law of Moses? Why don't men nowadays, why don't they complete that law, the circumcision law of the Old Covenant? Why don't they complete that? Why don't they offer animal sacrifices like the Old Covenant Jews did, like the apostles did? Those are Old Covenant laws, guys. We're not bounded by that. We're not bound to that. And so, again, it's picking and choosing, okay? Jesus observed the laws of the Old Testament, not just Sabbath. He also observed the circumcision law, the Jewish feast days, the new moons, etc. Why don't the Adventists do that? Now, another thing that they say is actually Luke chapter 23, verse 56. This is the best argument that they have in relation to this. Okay, guys? Let's take a look at what it says. Luke 23:56. The context is after our Lord Jesus Christ died on the cross and he was buried. This is what happens. It says, they returned and prepared spices and ointments. It's talking about the ladies that went and they went basically in service of Christ after he was buried. Okay. And it says, on the Sabbath, they rested according to the commandment. Okay. That they quote, and they say, they rested on the Sabbath after Jesus died in accordance with the commandment. So it's still a commandment. No. Here's 4 reasons why this does not work. You guys ready? 4 reasons why, or 5 reasons why it doesn't work. Number 1, this is actually not enough to show that Christians are bound to it. It just says that they did it. Now, the reason why this is actually a powerful reason is because of what's coming up next, okay? So make sure if you say this, say it all together, okay? The next thing, number 2, John 16:13. Jesus was with the apostles. This is before his resurrection, before his crucifixion. He says, there's many things that I want to tell you now, but you cannot bear to hear them. When the Spirit of truth comes, he will guide you into all the truth, for he will not speak on his own authority, but whatever he hears, he will speak, and he will declare to you the things to come. So who's going to be guided into all truth? The apostles. When the Spirit of truth comes. Jesus hadn't yet resurrected, and he hadn't yet sent forth the Holy Spirit until the day of Pentecost. So why would you expect them to necessarily know that they do not need to observe the Old Testament Sabbath? Point number 3. We see that St. Paul, for example, in Acts 16:3, he circumcised Timothy. And in Acts 16:3, Paul wanted Timothy to accompany him, and he took him and circumcised him because of the Jews who were in those places, for they all knew that his father was a Greek. Timothy was circumcised. Why don't they get circumcised? Why don't they teach that we need to be circumcised? Acts 26. Paul took the men, and the next day he purified himself along with them and went to the temple, giving notice when the days of purification would be fulfilled, and offering and the offering presented for each one of them. Those are the Levitical purification laws. Why are those not completed by the Seventh-day Adventists? Well, they will say, oh, well, because, the reason why Timothy was circumcised was because his mom was a Jew, and the Jews didn't even want to speak to him unless he was circumcised. And so he did it for the sake of the Jews, because he wanted to preach to them. He wanted to speak to them. And they wouldn't be able to listen to them because they're like, you're a Jew and you're not even circumcised. We don't want to speak to you. So he did it for the sake of the Jews so that he could preach to them. And then in Acts 21:26, it doesn't prove that we need to observe the old covenant, these old covenant Levitical laws either. And we'd agree with them. We would say, amen. Then why do you say the same thing for Luke 23:56? When it's even before Jesus resurrected, this is before the resurrection, before the Holy Spirit came down, revealing the fullness of truth to them, you really expect, it shouldn't be a surprise if they're still observing the Old Testament Sabbath. Does that make sense? And even if they chose to do it, that doesn't prove that Christians are bound to it, because again, Colossians 2:16-17, don't forget it, guys. It says that these are a shadow of the things to come. Just like the Seventh-day Adventists don't observe the other stuff, we don't need to observe the Old Testament Sabbath day either. Do you guys want to continue? You think it's good to continue? You think it's good to stop here, guys? Was that a lot of info? Or should we continue it for another 10 minutes? Okay, let's continue for another like 10 minutes, all right, guys? And if you guys think it's too much information, I mean, I'm gonna upload it anyways. But so another thing that Seventh-day Adventists say is Jesus says Sabbath is for man, not for the Jews only. And they get it from Mark chapter 2, verse 27, where it says, Jesus said to them, the Sabbath was made for man, And this is the part that they focus on. I even had this little debate on Facebook with a guy with a Seventh-day Adventist, and he quoted just that little snippet. He didn't quote anything else. He didn't even quote the last part where it says, not man for the Sabbath. It totally misses Jesus's point. He's not saying that the Sabbath was made for literally everybody on earth so that you could observe it for all of eternity. That's not what he's saying. That's not what Jesus is saying. Okay, first off, that term, all men, is used in reference to not literally every single person in existence. For example, Romans chapter 5, verse 12 and 18. Romans 5:12 says, therefore, just as sin came into the world through one man, through Adam, and death through sin, and so death spread to all men because all sinned. Here it says all men. Does that mean that all men literally died? Well, no, because even in the letter to the Hebrews, it tells us that Enoch didn't die. Enoch was assumed up. God took him. And in the letter to the Hebrews, it says that he did not die. Same thing with Psalm 56:1. It says, be gracious to me, O God, for men, humans, trample on me all day long, an attacker oppresses me. Is he literally saying that every single man in existence disrespected him? Well, no. Look at the prophet Nathan, for example, right? Definitely not. And so you can't just look at the fact that it says all men or men in plural and assume that it's talking about all of humanity. It's not. In the context, he's talking about those who oppress him. You have to look at the context and not just take things out of its context. In fact, many Seventh-day Adventists will say, well, look, the Greek word is anthropon. The Greek word is anthropon. And Seventh-day Adventists say that that means the entire humanity. That means humanity, the human race. Are you sure about that? John chapter 8, verses 15 to 18 uses the same word, anthropos, in the singular. The same word. And Jesus uses it to refer to God the Father. Are you telling me that God the Father is a human being? I mean, sure. Maybe you could extend that to Christ because, Christ assumed a human flesh, and so he was a human man. He was a human being, right? Because of his human nature that he assumed it. He was a true human man. But how can you say that about the Father, right? John chapter 8, verses 15 and 18, Jesus says, you judge according to the flesh. I judge no one. Yet even if I do judge, my judgment is true. For it is not I alone who judge, but I and the Father who sent me. So that's two, right? Then he says, in your law, the law of Moses, it is written that the testimony of two people is true. Okay? When he says two people, he says the word anthropon. Who are the two anthropon that he's talking about? I am the one who bears witness about myself, so that's one anthropon. Who's the other anthropon? And the Father who sent me bears witness about me. So the two anthropon is Jesus Christ and the Father. Does that mean that the Father is a human? No. So no, it doesn't mean literally all the time the whole human race. Not necessarily. It could simply mean persons. And as I wrote down here, it says it can mean human or just person. Anthropon can simply mean person/people. Okay? So Mark 2:27 can simply be the Sabbath was made for people, not people for the Sabbath. What people? The Old Testament Jews, the Old Covenant Jews, as we've been reading along this whole time. Now let's read the context to see what Jesus was talking about. Mark chapter 2, verses 23 to 28. It says, one Sabbath, he was going through the grain fields, and as they made their way, his disciples began to pluck heads of grain. So they were plucking heads of grain in order to eat. Okay? This is also found in Matthew chapter 12, by the way, guys. And the Pharisees were saying to him, look, why are they doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath, right? They were saying that why are they plucking heads of grain to eat if you're not allowed to do any work on the Sabbath, right? And he said to them, have you never read what David did? And this is found in 2 Samuel, guys. When he was in need and was hungry, he and those who were with him, so he was with his men, his army, how he entered the house of God, he entered the temple in the time of Abiathar, the high priest, and ate the bread of presence, which is not lawful for anybody but the priests to eat, and also gave it to those who were with him. So the bread of presence was only for the Old Testament priests, the Levitical priests, to eat, the sons of Aaron. That's it. That's it. Yet when he showed up to the temple, he and his men who were not Levitical priests, they ate the bread and they didn't sin. It wasn't a sin when he did it. What is Jesus trying to show? That look, this ceremonial law that was given to the old covenant Israelites can be ignored. It could be set aside when people are in need. Okay? They were in need because they were hungry, and the law says you have to feed the hungry. And so even though the bread of presence was meant only for the Old Testament priests, they made an exception and they gave it to King David and his men because they were hungry. They fed the needy, those who were in need. Notice that that is the point that Jesus is making. He's saying that the law of Moses, when it was given to the Israelites, it wasn't so that they could be enslaved by it. It was for their benefit. So when this law came about that the Old Testament priests are the only ones allowed to eat of that bread, an exception was made with King David and his men because they were in need. And so now Jesus is saying he extends it to the Sabbath now. And he said to them, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath, meaning the Sabbath, the Old Testament Sabbath day, was given to the ancient Israelites for their benefit so that they could have a day of rest. Right? It was made for their benefit, not so that they could be enslaved by it. That's Jesus's point. He's not saying that everybody has to do the Old Testament Sabbath. That's not what he's saying at all in the context. He's saying in the context, using David as an example with the bread of presence law, that it was given for their benefit, not so that they could be enslaved. So the Sabbath was made for man for the benefit of the ancient Israelites. It was not that the ancient Israelites had to be enslaved by the Sabbath. They were not made for the Sabbath, to serve the Sabbath, or be enslaved by the Sabbath. And so therefore, since Jesus is hungry and his apostles are hungry, he's going to do the same thing as David did, which is eat the bread of presence because they are in need. Yeah. That was his point. And then Jesus ends it by saying, so the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. So Jesus is saying, look, you don't even have a right to disagree with me because I am Lord of the Sabbath. I am the one that gave the ancient Israelites the Sabbath. If you knew who I was, you wouldn't even be questioning me to begin with. That's Jesus's point. So taking all of this into consideration, we see that Jesus is not saying what the Seventh-day Adventists claim. I think it's good to end here, guys. The rest is going to be pretty good, just like today.